All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nir Isakovich, and I am the director of the Applied Ethics Center at UMass Boston. And this is a talk in our AIX series, Artificial Intelligence and Experience. Very happy to have Professor Evan Selinger here with us tonight from the Rochester Institute of Technology. Evan Selinger will be speaking about the threat of normalizing automated surveillance. A few words about Evan's bio. So Evan teaches philosophy at RIT and is also an affiliate scholar at Northeastern's Center for Law, Innovation, and Creativity. The Observer selected his recent book, Reengineering Humanity, that was co-authored with Brett Frischman and published by Cambridge, as one of the best books of 2018 and one of 30 books to help us understand the world in 2020. And Zadie Smith told the Wall Street Journal that it was one of her favorite books in 2019. So that's quite an endorsement there. Evan's research focuses primarily on technology ethics and privacy, and beyond the usual academic activity, he regularly collaborates with civil society organizations like the ACLU, the Future of Privacy Forum, and the Institute for Defense Analysis. He advises government agencies such as DARPA and corporations such as Microsoft, and writes for popular newspapers, magazines, and blogs like The Times, The Guardian, The Atlantic, Slate, and Wired. So, Evan, a great honor to have you with us. Thank you for making the time, and I very much look forward to this. So, our usual process is Evan will speak anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour, and then the rest of the time will be for Q&A. So, Evan, take it away, sir.
Yeah, thanks. Well, obviously, look, it's an honor to give this talk here at the Center for Applied Ethics. Nir, I very much appreciate the invitation. James, I appreciate you recommending me. Maria, I appreciate you providing lots of great feedback before even this talk. So this is really, just a great event. And I also want to emphasize that the talk that I'm going to give was done in collaboration with a really wonderful student named Judy Ray. So this is me talking, but on the basis of stuff we've worked on together. And I'm even going to thank everybody else here because this is the first time I've talked on this topic. So you are all my guinea pigs, and we'll see how this goes. We'll first see if I can share my screen. We tested this out before; it was working fine. Let's hope it continues. Okay. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about the threat of normalizing automated surveillance, and this is very much a talk about privacy. And as you all know, privacy is an inherently contested concept. So we need a quick and ready definition for when I'm going to talk about privacy today. And so for the purpose of this talk, I just mean it in a very thinly defined sense of informational privacy, right? Privacy is a kind of power. It's the power to have enough control over our intimate personal information to prevent others from unduly doing things that we don't want them to do, inhibiting us from unwinding, thwarting our capacity to pursue intimate relations, constraining our ability to develop autonomously, and impeding our participation in essential democratic activities. So I think this very conversational way of putting things, I think it makes it clear why privacy is valuable. And I think it also makes it clear why surveillance can be harmful, right? We know that chilling effects can inhibit free expression. We know that surveillance can leave us susceptible to social programming, the kind of programming that increases the control other people have over us, over our beliefs and our desires and our preferences. And we know that surveillance makes us vulnerable to others exercising their power over us to limit our opportunities and liberties. And that can sometimes be for hidden, arbitrary, or unfair reasons. So I think at the outset, these kinds of basic things are clear. What is less clear is why normalization is concerning. This is the puzzle I want to unpack today. I was obsessed with this. This is my first sort of round of trying to make sense of why it's concerning. So why is normalizing surveillance a problem, right? So as there are new opportunities that we're seeing for conducting surveillance, we're finding scholars, we're finding activists, like in the Venn diagram, they're overlapping. They are all very worried that normalization is threatening privacy and civil liberties. These are very rhetorically powerful warnings. When you see these, like normalization is happening, we're supposed to kind of shiver. The problem is a lot of the conversations are very imprecise. They're imprecise about what causes normalization, and they're imprecise about what happens when normalization occurs. And so one of my main goals in this talk is to explain what exactly does normalization mean when we're expressing concerns about surveillance. I think this fits kind of the phenomenological track record of the center. And I'm going to try to clarify what consequences normalization has for governance. So I'm not really going to make normative arguments, more I'm going to sort of pick out exactly what I think some of the troubling normative issues are. So to get there, to get to the finish line, I'm going to try to answer a few questions, right? These are our guiding questions, like, are normalization claims just sort of vague worries about the inherent uncertainty of the future? Or are they targeting very specific problems, like an authoritarian surveillance state eroding our fundamental rights, or people losing their ability to think critically about surveillance? I also want to figure out, should we take normalization warnings seriously? And if we should, are there any acceptable standards for determining if a normalization threat is it credible? Is it significant? And if it really is worrisome, well, what can society do about it? So to anchor this, there's a kind of baseline concern that we need to begin with, right? In order to figure out what makes normalization concerning, we got to put it in the right context. And for me, that context is a baseline concern about AI-infused surveillance. Many are arguing it poses such a steep risk to society that it should only be conducted if truly necessary, right? If truly necessary and other ethical conditions obtain. But why is that, right? Like at face value, you might go, well, why are people so worried about AI-driven surveillance or automated surveillance these days? I mean, after all, anxiety about surveillance goes hand in hand with the history of innovation, right? Every time new technologies mediate human interaction, we've got clashes between old norms and new norms, and debates arise and debates continue. For example, right back in 1890, Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis, they were motivated to write their seminal Harvard Law Review article, The Right to Privacy, because they were worried about innovation at the time. A very inexpensive and easy to use Kodak camera, it suddenly made it easy to democratize photography. And so Warren and Brandeis were fretting about people taking pictures without permission, and they were worried about the rapid and widespread distribution of newspaper articles that could include these photographs. Or we could flash forward a little bit after that. As soon as the telephone was invented and became widespread, that challenged traditional norms for maintaining privacy, right? So this idea that we have innovation, it transforms our norms, there's a debate, to some extent that isn't new. But the argument is being made, and I'm very sympathetic to the argument, that the forms of surveillance that are starting to be conducted today, that are intensifying and ramping up, are qualitatively different from past versions. So I want to give a few reasons why I would classify it in that sort of troubling way. So I think the present is very much a seminal moment, that surveillance is becoming exponentially more pervasive and more powerful. We have cameras and sensors proliferating throughout public and private spaces. They're generating photographs and videos and digital records of all kinds of personal information. The cost of storing big data in the cloud and purchasing easily upgradable surveillance equipment, well, that's dropping precipitously. And tools infused with AI, they hold out the promise, not yet realized, but the promise of significantly improving automated analysis. And I think these trends are very disconcerting for several reasons in context where surveillance can be used as a mechanism for establishing, maintaining, and expanding power, for exercising control through observation, identification, classification, and registration. So let's just think a little bit more about this milieu that we're currently in, why this baseline concern about surveillance exists. We have a range of powerful actors that are incentivized to continually ramp up their surveillance activities and technologies, right? So many, including government agencies and big tech companies, are frequently accused of being untrustworthy. In fact, the rise of the surveillance economy has led to jobs that are criticized so harshly, it's almost unbelievable to believe they're permitted. Philosopher Carissa Velez goes so far as to claim, I have never encountered a good argument to justify data brokers. Data brokers are the scavengers of the digital landscape and very rarely have any regard for the people whose data they're profiting from. At the same time, we've got severe regulatory gaps. I mean, I could go on and on about this, but the Cliff Note version, and I'm going to be very US focused for this, is that in the US, for the most part, there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in public spaces or when voluntarily disclosing information to third parties, right? The third party doctrine. And furthermore, our whole privacy regime is pretty much anchored in a notice and consent regime. And that, in fact, also dominates consumer privacy regulations in Europe. It's central to the GDPR, but it doesn't work at scale. It just doesn't. It's overwhelming. It's not viable. So we've got new technological capabilities, the likes of which we haven't seen before, major regulatory gaps. And on top of that, there's a few other issues that I think structurally make today's surveillance so troubling, right? So if we look at this image on the left, I think the public is in the dark about many aspects of surveillance. So it's a transparency issue. Surveillance has many invisible dimensions, and some of the resulting harms may never be uncovered. And I think others aren't going to be known until long after the tracking takes place and determined litigators, investigative journalists, and commissions shed light on their abuses. So we're always kind of playing catch up, which is a problem. And then the image on the right is supposed to sort of suggest that because surveillance harms often have disproportionate effects on minorities and other vulnerable groups, this is a major problem for a democracy because the majority of society is incentivized to deprioritize and dismiss these problems. So to wrap all of this up in terms of like where we're at descriptively, I think, although of course it's a value-laden description of the present state of surveillance, I want to turn to Jay Stanley. So Jay is a senior policy analyst at the ACLU, and he characterizes the present as a profound transitional moment in history. He contends we are on the cusp of a fundamental change in the nature of surveillance that is akin to a phase transition in physics. And here's what I think he means. It's a change from collecting and storing surveillance to mass automated real-time monitoring. And it's exemplified by technologies that can do things like alert the authorities when someone is deemed suspicious. And it doesn't require any human assistance at all. It's the human out of the loop problem. So in short, surveillance technology is increasingly being deployed as smart systems are designed, potentially in real time, to infer who are these people and what are they doing and are they dangerous, and let's predict what might they do in the future. Let me bring this down to a real experiential level, so this doesn't sound so pie in the sky. Let's just consider a very mundane kind of an interaction, right? And I think this will illustrate why contemporary automated surveillance poses an unprecedented danger. Look, imagine two people, two friends, they're sort of out in public and they're having an intimate conversation about the ruling party's political flaws, okay? If this is happening today, if this is you and your buddy, probably you don't have much to worry about. Why? Not because the law per se is protecting you, because the transaction costs of this becoming a problem, practically speaking, are pretty steep, right? Like, as long as you're not shouting and drawing attention to yourself, most people are far too busy due to civil inattention and their own preoccupations to eavesdrop or really care. And the government isn't incentivized at this moment to try to monitor all citizens. So pretty much you can be in public and you could be having a very intimate private conversation. Although it's usually referred to as privacy, I guess I would characterize this based on work that I've done with Woody Hartzog as you're protected by obscurity, right? The transaction costs are what protecting you. I can invert the scenario and say, you could imagine being in a crowded restaurant filled with other people and have this kind of obscurity in public, right? So there are forms of privacy or obscurity in public that we take for granted because we're just so used to having them, because we're not used to thinking about the erosion of transaction costs in a powerful and fundamental way. But let's vary this. So here's a hypothetical for the future, right? So imagine that society elects another authoritarian president, and this person wages a war on free speech and has access to data from ubiquitously deployed cameras. So cameras all over the place with facial recognition technology that can identify who people are, and facial characterization technology that can infer, well, what kind of mood are they in? And what are the nuances that they're trying to convey? And maybe even automated lip reading software. Government agencies could control this infrastructure, or the information might even flow through a centralized private surveillance network designed to readily share information with government agencies. So a world in which there's a very different infrastructure than we have now, but not all that different. So if this happens, if this type of future conversation is going to happen, obscurity is going to be profoundly threatened, if not fundamentally eviscerated, right? If you try to manage boundaries by speaking in hushed tones to the person that you're with, that's not going to help, because the automated lip reading technology is going to give you away. And you might try to kind of mask a little bit what you're saying, but maybe your facial expressions are going to reveal far more than you intend to convey because of the facial characterization software. And of course, you'll be de-anonymized. So this is somewhat of an Orwellian society, and in it, maybe, criticizing the president while you're strolling down the alley or walking through the park, that might result in automated systems reporting the disapproving judgment to authorities who have you, the critic, arrested. So I think these types of scenarios, and you could throw in your own, but I really don't think this is very Black Mirror or too far off. I think given everything that we've discussed, right, I'm trying to show a kind of where is Waldo, right? That used to be hard, but the transaction costs would plummet in the way that I just suggested in the scenario. And I think this gives us the kind of baseline concern. So the baseline concern is basically this, that given the way that surveillance is ramping up, given the fact that the law is so lagging behind the times, we really can't afford to conduct any more surveillance than is necessary. I mean, in parts of the world where privacy protections are even weaker than they are here, or they do an even worse job of preventing disparate impacts, I think surveillance can feel like the sword of Damocles just waiting to drop. So there are good reasons to want to limit surveillance as a precautionary measure. But the problem is, again, as far as policy goes, this is incredibly difficult to do, especially when most of our privacy regime is rooted in ideas like if you want privacy, well, then you either need secrecy or you need confidentiality. But those aren't the kinds of protections that are going to help in like the scenario I just showed, where you're walking out in public. If we continue with this idea that there's no reasonable expectation of privacy in public, it's because these rules were constructed at a time where you didn't need the law to protect you. But changing these things would be, I think, fairly radical. And I'm not so sure that we're going to be able to make it work. In fact, part of the problem lies at the heart of privacy theory itself, right? Regimes that are constructed to protect our privacy, that use documents like the Fair Information Practice Principles, they're really focused on how to process data fairly. They think of that as a virtuous goal. And so in a way, you could look at contemporary privacy policy, like a lot of it, as having the consequence of normalizing surveillance. It's just trying to create rules for processing the data and storing the data and sharing the data without really providing a robust way of saying, well, it shouldn't even be conducted in the first place. So with this as a background, now we can start talking about what exactly does normalizing surveillance mean? And what I'm going to try to do is to suggest that although the word is used, normalizing, it isn't just one thing. I think there are four sort of analytically distinct concerns about surveillance. So when we hear sort of privacy scholars and we hear activists talk about normalization, I think they can mean four different things. I hadn't, prior to starting this research with Judy, I hadn't seen any taxonomy of this. I didn't see anybody attempting to say, well, can we divide this discourse into different kinds of concerns? And I think it's important to do that, because if we recognize differences in the concerns, well, two things can follow. Certain strategies might be better for meeting some concerns as opposed to others. And as I sort of move through the talk, I'm going to make the claim that perhaps the most concerning normalization concern, something I'm going to end up calling favorably disposed normalization, is something that's been presented very speculatively without very much empirical justification. I'm going to try to present some empirical justification that can make us take it a bit more seriously. So let's go through what these four concerns about normalization are. The first one is what I would call ongoing surveillance. So this is a concern that new approaches to surveillance are going to persist even when they're introduced to society as temporary measures used only for coping with emergencies, right? I think you could take a kind of sort of cynical interpretation of a quote that's regularly attributed to Churchill to make sense of this, right? The idea is that, some people will never not try to, capitalize, right? One person's, emergencies, another person's opportunity. And so we have emergencies that seem to never end, like the war on terror. Look at what's happening now as an example, right? So during the COVID pandemic, right, privacy and civil liberties advocates have been almost apoplectic about technologies being rolled out that are touted as tools for improving public health temporarily. They're worried that these might persist long after the pandemic ends. So here's one example, the example of the so-called shout drone, right? So in response to police departments using shout drones, so shout drone was the idea of people weren't following social distancing guidelines. So the idea was to basically put a speaker on a small portable drone that would shout things like, please maintain appropriate social distance. People were concerned, like Jay Stanley at the ACLU, and they were warning that, look, the coronavirus crisis is going to normalize drones. It's going to further entrench them in American life. And the worry was that what we're accepting today is going to live on and haunt us in the future. Now, what could justify that type of concern? I think if you do a little political economy, one answer is, well, economics, more bang for your buck, right? So could this concern about something like a shout drone be plausible? I think so. And I think one of the structural drivers is the idea that, well, we know that the pandemic has wreaked havoc on the economy. Every organization, or most organizations, are having minimized budgets. Many public institutions are basically, dealing with austerity. So all things considered, if law enforcement, and I'm just using shout drone as an example, you can fill in others, if you invest in a new tool or a bit of infrastructure, you're claiming we're just going to use it now, but later on, for a minimal bit of investment, you can extract more value from it, particularly in a tight budget, you're going to be incentivized to upgrade the devices. And that means potentially performing new functions. And that means the enhancements, particularly if they're inexpensive, could be driving function creep and surveillance creep. So in the case of shout drones, like what might that mean specifically? Well, Stanley says that could mean adding stingrays to collect information from people's mobile phones, or night vision cameras, or GPS sensors, or radar, or LiDAR, or thermal, or infrared cameras, right? These are all very inexpensive plug-and-play mechanisms. So in short, this first concern about ongoing surveillance is that things that seem to the public cost-benefit justified to deal with an extraordinary circumstance, they become the new normal. The state of exception ends up becoming a kind of inaugural moment to create a persistent and ongoing bit of surveillance creep. Then I think there's a second concern about normalization, and that's selective attention. Selective attention is the idea that as new forms of surveillance are being unrolled, the public is not giving due consideration to relevant and foreseeable risks, that instead they're just focusing on benefits that they're being told are the whole story. So, for example, a few months ago, Amazon had a big product expo, and it's talking about rolling out its new home surveillance drone. And of course, if you look at the promotional material, what's this thing going to be good for flying around your home? Well, of course, it's going to plug and play with your Ring surveillance system. It's going to be great for deterring crime. It's going to be great for capturing crime. We know at this stage of neoliberalism, right, we need to rely on ourselves, so homeowners need to take extra precautions, right? That's sort of how it's pitched. But Ryan Kalo, a law professor, says, well, let's just think a little bit more about other possibilities that the boosters aren't emphasizing. He says, if this type of mobile surveillance is normalized, my concern is it's going to allow abusers to check in on their partners wherever they are. They'll erase surveillance blind spots, and it will remove excuses that the surveilled individual was merely off camera. In other words, he's worried about this exacerbating a real and persistent problem of domestic abuse, child abuse, spouse abuse, roommate abuse. And so his point isn't that this is definitively going to happen. It's that as society begins to adopt these things, we adopt them as consumers. We think individualistically. We pick them because we're being told it's going to help us protect our own property. And so there's insufficient consideration to risks here that are absolutely foreseeable. That's the kind of selective attention. I'll give another example of this, right? We've had similar warnings about selective attention. I mean, there's all kinds of sort of myopic motivations we're told that this happens with. But here's another example. So Matthew Guariglia, a policy analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, he's worried about police departments suddenly using robotic dogs, right? And he argues they could get upgraded to roving surveillance towers. Now, that's not their current use at all, but here's what Guariglia states, and I think it's interesting. He says, well, when we hear the hype about this, it's very little about these tools as providing any police work. It's about introducing these robots as a fun thing. There's kind of whimsy behind them. You could go take a selfie with a police officer in one of these. So he's worried that we then end up over focusing. So if the Amazon drone cam, if the problem there is we myopically focus on, is it going to protect our homes, but we don't look at the consequences for other scenarios like victims of domestic abuse, the idea here is our attention is so much on, well, isn't this going to be fun? Isn't this like an interesting thing to do? We don't pay attention to how easily upgradable these things can become and sort of more nefarious motivations. It's like a Trojan horse. You introduce it for one reason, and then later on we get the bait and switch. Then there's a third concern about normalization, what we're calling unexceptional habituation. And the idea is basically this, that society has grown so accustomed to rampant surveillance that we take powerful systems for granted. In fact, at this point, we see them as unremarkable. In other words, repeated exposure to these systems has left us cognitively and emotionally unmoved by ongoing monitoring and analysis. So I think there's a really great quote here from my colleague, Woody Hartzog, who I often write with. He says, most people probably don't regularly think about the fact that nearly everywhere we go, hundreds of surveillance devices are either always on or ready to hit the record at a moment's notice, or hit record, at a moment's notice. Surveillance has become so normalized that we as a society rarely protest when surveillance cameras go up on nearly every other corner in every public building. So if this phenomenon is true, if we are developing a kind of nonchalant attitude, it is putting people at risk of growing numb to the possibility that one day powerful actors could abuse the surveillance infrastructure that we've taken for granted, whether it's through subtle changes that leave people unable to perceive slow aggregate impacts, or if it's through rapid transitions like power grabs during emergencies. And so we have here this quote from Alistair Duff, a professor of information policy. He's warning that we've already got cameras everywhere, drones, facial recognition. These have all become normalized. There can be no doubt that the infrastructure for complete totalitarianism is now in place should power fall into the wrong hands. So part of the complacency is if this happens during a regime that we're not terribly worried about, but that might be a bit of sleepwalking, to use an old Langdon Winter phrase. So I've only gone over 3 of the normalization concerns. I'm gearing up to the 4th and most speculative and most troubling one, but let's just deal with these 3. I mean, are they valid, and how would we know? So I think when it comes to the issue of ongoing surveillance and selective attention and unacceptable habituation, we can say a few sort of straightforward things, right? So I think it is relatively easy to determine if particular surveillance technologies do continue to be used, despite our initial hopes that they're only going to be temporary and only used during emergencies. So we will find out one way or the other whether these technologies that we're told are so concerning during the pandemic live on beyond. So I mean, now I could have given the example of vaccine passports. So when you hear all of these privacy advocates and civil liberties advocates saying beware, 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 and we want to know if it's true, well, you can kind of find out if it's true. But I also want to add, it's not that straightforward. Because let's say it doesn't turn out to happen. This is what makes it a little bit difficult to verify. Maybe the warnings affected the flow of the future. So maybe some of these things don't become deeply entrenched, and that doesn't make the concerned predictions any less important. It just means they actually had some efficacy. And we could say the same thing about selective attention, right? We will at some point hopefully find out, assuming that there's some decent reporting, and some decent transparency about whether things like, Amazon's Always Home Cam drone ends up doing the kinds of things that Ryan is worried about, or whether these, police shout drones that Jay Stanley is worried about end up doing these things. The most difficult to verify is unexceptional habituation, right? Because I think we can explain this phenomenon in multiple ways. Someone who's experiencing what I'm calling here unexceptional habituation, well, they might be motivated by other things. Maybe it just looks unexceptional from the outside. Maybe they're actually experiencing resignation, a sense of privacy fatalism, because they believe that institutional constraints are so steep that really nobody can do anything. Or maybe so much exposure to surveillance is leading them to kind of, I don't know, rationalize that there are no alternatives. So I definitely think unexceptional habituation may indeed be a pervasive phenomenon, but it's hard to know from the outside in. There is at least a few other plausible explanations of this. Now, I do think, fortunately, there are some straightforward ways of responding to the problems of selective attention and unexceptional habituation. I'll offer one strategy, right? One strategy that privacy advocates emphasize is better public communication that focuses on what I'm going to call surveillance sensitivity, right? And this doesn't necessarily mean adopting emotionally powerful but morally contentious techniques like hyperbolic rhetoric. It doesn't mean being manipulative. It doesn't mean using scare tactics. On a basic way, it just really means depicting surveillance harms that people are not perceiving in more viscerally engaging ways. And so sometimes this can be achieved by pairing abstractions like chilling effects or so on, or surveillance is harmful, with very resonant, concrete examples of situations where surveillance could deter reasonable people from exercising their right to criticize authorities, like we saw over the summer with the Black Lives Matter protests. At a more sophisticated level, maybe we could adopt strategies like moral piggybacking, right? So moral piggybacking is when we try to expand people's moral imaginations by merging issues that people are more morally neutral about, like surveillance, or more uncertain about, with ones that they have stronger moral responses to. So recently, the Boston Celtics, right, I'm giving this talk here, Boston Celtics, the basketball team wrote an op-ed about the dangers of facial recognition technology, and they engaged in moral piggybacking because they connected their concerns about a technology that people might not at all associate with police inquiry to moral outrage about concrete violations over racial justice. And they also pointed out two very disconcerting, very concrete facts. The first is that in the US, the police are 3 times as likely to kill Black people than white people. And secondly, high status professional athletes like them have been victimized by racial profiling and discriminatory policing. And now this brings us to the most troubling concern about normalization, the most speculatively posed one. This is the one I was obsessed with trying to make heads or tails out of. And this is the concern that I'm calling favorably disposed normalization. And it's this basic worry that as surveillance becomes routine, people will see being surveilled as acceptable and possibly desirable. And we hear examples of this all the time. So in an EFF report, we're warned that if unchecked, EdTech is going to normalize the next generation to a digital world where users are just handing over data without question in return for free services. And this was going to be a world that is less private, not just by default, but design. More recently, Lindsay Oliver, the activism project manager at the EFF, she expressed concern about this type of surveillance and normalization with respect to the AI proctoring that some universities are doing. She warns that by subjecting students to this, we might be indoctrinating them to believe later on down the road that spyware deployed by bosses at work or by abusive partners is acceptable because it's normal. Or here's another example. Law professor Barbara Fetters warns that the constant and expanding classroom of surveillance conducted by trusting teachers and administrators in public schools from kindergarten through high school is socializing students to accept the routine collection and retention of their personal information. And as a result, she's worried that there's an increasing power disparity growing between data users and data suppliers. So unfortunately, out of the 4 surveillance concerns, favorably disposed normalization, I think it's the most difficult one to address. Well, why? Well, because it's a powerful talking point and it has a lot of intuitive appeal, right? The more that we're exposed to something, the more widespread something is, the more favorably disposed we are to it. But until I started this research, I hadn't seen any attempt in the literature to integrate empirical studies of normalization that might provide some kind of, I guess, scientific credibility to the concern. So let's see if there is any. And I do want to admit from the outset that, much like I pointed out with other issues, what appears to be favorably disposed normalization, it might in fact be another phenomenon, right? Maybe it is rationalization. These things are very sort of hard to know from the outside. But I think it's important to consider what some empirical evidence for favorably disposed normalization is, because critics, often very libertarian critics, are just dismissing this concern out of hand. They're saying, look, this is just another speculative worry. We've heard these time and time again. It's another techno panic. People have status quo bias. They're unable to adapt to something new. This really isn't a concern. So I want to talk about some empirical evidence. And I want to put this in one other bit of context, which is, privacy scholars and activists have often had a hard time sort of persuading people about the veracity of what they're claiming, because the disciplines haven't been well interfaced with empirical studies. So we've been told, for example, that even something like chilling effects, which seems sort of axiomatic to surveillance studies, we've been told they've got very little empirical support and they're just articles of faith. But in recent years, we've been starting to see some studies about those, and these things are sort of promising. So what can we say about the empirics of favorably disposed normalization, right? Here I want to talk about the research that I think is the most relevant, and it's research conducted by psychology professor Adam Baer and philosophy and cognitive science professor Joshua Knobe, because they've conducted some rather interesting inquiry into what people believe when they believe that something is normal. And I think there are two very relevant findings for this conversation here. Here's the first finding. So according to Knobe and Baer, when people determine if something's normal, they generally take into account descriptive and prescriptive information if they're both available. So for example, the more prevalent something is, which is descriptive, and the more people perceive it to be good, prescriptive, the more normal people ordinarily will see the phenomenon as. So practically speaking, this would mean increasing the frequency of something occurring, like expanding surveillance, would heighten the likelihood that people will find it normal. So I'm just going to summarize really quickly some key points from their findings. So they found that when there is a significant difference between what is statistically average and what is normatively ideal, most people believe what is normal is better than average, but worse than ideal. So favorably disposed. So in one study, they asked participants, well, what's a normal amount of TV for someone to watch? And most people gave an answer that fell in between their conceptions of the average amount, something descriptive, and the ideal amount, prescriptive. So not exactly ideal, but better than average. And in another study, they asked participants to perform the following task. They said, look, imagine someone watches, a certain amount of hours of TV a day. Well, rate the extent to which you think this is a large or small amount of hours. And the majority of subjects' responses demonstrated that their conceptions of normal TV watching, it fell somewhere in between their conception of the average and the ideal. And in another study, they made up an imaginary hunting tool. They called it a stagnar. And they tried to figure out what the participants would believe would be the size of a normal size stagnar. And it turned out to be in between their conception of an average and ideal size. So that's the sort of first relevant finding. And there have been more studies, such as ones recently conducted by Wysocki, who was analyzing people's judgments of a fictional person's opinion and a fictional person's driving style. So we're beginning to see a little bit more empirical support for this view. And Joshua Baer and Knobe also have one other relevant finding that I think is super important here. And that's, they argue, when people make decisions in their everyday lives, they use an undifferentiated notion of normality. So what does that mean? Well, instead of interpreting a phenomenon by assessing the degree to which it is statistically average, and then, as a separate process, assessing the degree to which it is prescriptively ideal, They say people do something simpler. We take a kind of cognitive shortcut. So what does this mean? Well, one implication of this cognitive tendency, if it is real, is that as something becomes more widespread, people won't just take it to be more prevalent, they'll perceive it to be more normal. And seeing something as more normal can make them more favorably disposed to it. So the opposite is true too. Seeing something as more abnormal can make you less favorably disposed. So here's an interesting case study that they try to explain using their theory. So in this study, a cohort of children, they're given information about a fictional social group that only eats orange berries. And then subsequently, the children are told that there's one member of the group who eats berries that aren't of this color. They're not orange. And so the majority of participants inferred that the socially deviant behavior, right, what is not statistically prevalent, is wrong. And so Baer and Knob say, well, here's a way to explain this. And the way they explain it is, well, when the children are informed that the social groups only eat orange berries, they don't just view it to be a common activity, they see it as a normal practice. In other words, even without providing prescriptive information about the goodness of eating berries of this color, the children appear to have cognitively blurred what is descriptively common and what is prescriptively favorable. In other words, they learn morality from normality. And if we're inclined to think that this is just aberration of a less developed adolescent mind, Knob and Baer are suggesting this is probably the default mode of thinking that adults engage in too. So to be sure, seeing something as normal doesn't necessarily mean seeing it as moral, but it does mean becoming more favorably disposed to it. So to illustrate what this would mean practically speaking, let's consider a hypothetical comparison, right? Between someone who believes surveillance is morally wrong and deeply abnormal with someone who shares the moral assessment but believes the surveillance is normal. Since the moral judgment is consistent in both cases, well, how might their different views on normality impact their sensibilities? Well, the person who believes that surveillance is abnormal, they might be appalled at a visceral level, while the person who sees it as normal might be less appalled. And I think this emotional difference might determine if someone is actually motivated to act. So for example, if you believe Facebook is morally bad, but a normal platform, you might just complain about it, but you might lack the motivation to delete your account. But if you believe that, but if your beliefs about normality are such, you might believe that you are motivated to act. And I think there's also supporting literature for this in other sorts of fields. Just really quickly, to go over one experiment conducted by a behavioral scientist and marketing professor. They were looking at how communication strategies in an environmental context motivate people, right? So in one study, they describe a sign that is just describing information, saying, well, approximately 75% of guests are participating in this program in a hotel, and they are saving energy by using their towels more than once. And the other sign that the other group is given, that's normative. Help, save the environment, show your respect for nature, use your towel more than once. And it turned out that the descriptive messaging was more effective than the prescriptive variety. And I think this undifferentiated conception of normality that Knob and Baer present, I think it explains why. By informing hotel guests that many people reuse towels, the messaging does more than merely convey that people often do it. It communicates a norm, and it identifies behavior that people typically believe is normal. Maybe it even influences people who hold a favorable moral view of pro-environmental behavior to be more emotionally invested and actually act on it. And we've seen sort of similar research about people stealing bark from trees in Arizona's Petrified National Park. The studies suggest that there's a framing problem. So if you alert people that routine vandalization is occurring, instead of deterring vandalization, well, people seem to vandalize because they're just going with the flow because they believe it's normal behavior. Obviously, a lot more research needs to be done on this. I mean, I'm I guess arguing. I think the studies by Baer and Knob provide some empirical support for the favorably disposed normalization thesis, but there's still a lot of open questions. Like, for example, take, say, the ubiquitous adoption of Amazon Ring cameras. Let's say we become normalized to them. Well, does that mean we're just becoming favorably disposed to this particular approach to surveillance? Or does that mean we're becoming more normalized to surveillance in general? Does this mean we're becoming more favorably disposed to corporations like Amazon, or to surveillance in general that would also extend to the government, right? Nope and Bear's research is so new, it doesn't provide any answer to that. Here's another one, right? And this is a concern that I have to admit, I'm mentioning somebody else who's given it, but I've speculatively made this claim too. Jennifer Lynch, who's the surveillance litigation director at the EFF, she's given the following kind of example. She says, look, it is a slippery slope from using facial recognition on your phone to basically being favorably disposed to the government using it, right? And so the idea is that as we become used to a technology in some context, the theory goes, well, we're becoming favorably disposed in a way that we will become more positive towards it in others. Like, so is that true? I don't know. I mean, obviously, if we're unlocking our phones with our faces, that's technically facial verification. Apple should get an A++ for its privacy by design, right? Our face prints are localized to the hard drive of our phones. They're not being stored in the cloud. You're not building a name face database when you use it. But what if this favorably disposed normalization thesis has legs? Then it might be cognitively and affectively altering our sensibilities in ways that it would have implications for government surveillance. So I just want to end this talk by talking about what I see as some of the consequences that follow if the favorably disposed normalization thesis is in fact a widespread phenomenon. Okay, I'm going to go through three. I think the first issue is it is yet another factor that ever further undermines our autonomy. So I think favorably disposed normalization can impede our autonomy, and then it has significant ethical consequences, okay? So to think about this, I think we need to think about the mind the way that a lot of researchers do. We need to think about dual process theory and sort of cognitive biases. So we know that according to dual process theory, right, human cognition has two basic modes, the automatic and the reflective, right? We rely on the automatic mode in situations like acting quickly without having adequate information or relevant experience, or acting without getting sufficient feedback, or acting under the sway of strong moods and feelings. So in these types of circumstances, people rely on shortcuts like heuristics, which are practical but not necessarily rational or optimal problem-solving methods. And so we know that we rely on all kinds of things like anchoring effect and so on. And this potentially makes us vulnerable to cognitive biases, right? Things that might have had an original evolutionary value, but these days make us vulnerable to new forms of exploitation. So let's think about like democratic governance, thinking about surveillance and decisions about it. Look, there are situations where we're just going to be relying on the automatic mode, but there are going to be governance situations where we can rely on the reflective mode. So although actual circumstances may never meet the ideal conditions where we have perfect information and an abundance of time, nevertheless, there are situations where we can have decent information and a certain amount of quality time. But the problem is, if favorably disposed normalization is in fact just how the mind works, this means we're going to have attitudes, we're going to have beliefs, we're going to have emotional dispositions towards surveillance for causal reasons that are not transparent to us. We are not going to recognize that as things become perceived as normal, we begin to become more disposed favorably towards them, not because we've understood their benefits to outweigh the detriments, because that's how this undifferentiated notion of normality works. And so one consequence of that becomes, not only do we become biased in our deliberations, like another cognitive bias, without us being aware of it, but it could lead towards more group conformity about surveillance, because there will be less independent thinking as surveillance begins to become more exponentially powerful and pervasive. So that's one possible sort of normative concern or governance concern I have, right? The weakening of autonomy for reasons that we have yet to fully identify. So our supposed deliberation and discourse about surveillance is tainted, and tainted in ways that aren't transparent to the individual cognizer. And then I think if this is true, there are some pretty profound regulatory consequences. The first one is obviously, if favorably disposed normalization has this impact over us, it impacts the will to curb unwarranted surveillance. And that means we're going to have all kinds of difficulties. Like, we're going to have difficulty banning invasive ed tech. So, for example, right now, we've got basic neuroeducational tools like sensors that monitor student brain signal activity to infer when they're concentrating. They're starting to be used in the class. But if these devices become more normalized, right, because they become more frequent, then perhaps over time, parents and teachers and administrators might find it exceptionally difficult to carefully assess the costs and benefits of adopting newer and even more cognitively invasive educational technologies, right? I mean, ultimately, it might become exceptionally difficult for movements to gain widespread support where school advocates say we need to ban extremely invasive practices. Another impact of shifting our cognitive and emotional sensibilities this way is that it might impact an ever lowering of our standards for what counts as a reasonable expectation of privacy, right? So in the context of regulating inappropriate government surveillance, law professors Matthew Toksin and Ari Ezra Waldman warn that if people believe surveillance is acceptable because it's pervasive, meaning if they believe it because if it's normal and common, it must be acceptable, that makes it very hard in the US for judges to set high standards for reasonable expectations of privacy. And this is a key constitutional standard for determining if law enforcement agents are violating things like the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. And then finally, and again, I'm going to be very US centric here, in countries like the US, even if we could acknowledge that this cognitive bias existed, it's kind of hard to see how the law could recognize this as a harm, right? So law professors Daniel Solov and Daniel Citron have observed that the courts have been reaching wildly inconsistent conclusions about the issues of harm, despite there being very good reasons to expect greater clarity and greater sensitivity towards a broader approach. So for example, the US Supreme Court case of Clapper versus Amnesty International, it ruled that fear and anxiety about surveillance and the cost of taking measures to protect against it are too speculative to satisfy the injury in fact requirement to warrant legal standing. On the other hand, there are some signs that the law might be evolving. So in Spokio versus Robbins, the US Supreme Court required the plaintiff to prove a concrete injury while failing to meaningfully elaborate on the boundaries of that concept. And so the court determined that an intangible injury, including the risk of injury, it might be sufficient to establish harm. Unfortunately, as Solov notes, that opinion begs so many questions, it leaves so much unresolved. It kind of resembles an M.C. Escher painting, right? Only time is going to tell whether a case like that will signal deeper change to acknowledge more concrete harms. More intangible harms. But let's also think about this in terms of acclimated consumers and industry practices, right? So if we combine these things, these concerns about ongoing surveillance and selective attention and unexceptional habituation, they also give rise to an array of regulatory challenges. So for example, Woody Hartzog claims that once consumer behavior becomes normalized, it becomes harder to push back on, both as a consumer and as a matter of policy. And what he's saying is that basically regulators find it very difficult to protect people from surveillance practices that they've already acclimated to. And there are several reasons why, right? One is economics. Once a new surveillance feature becomes incorporated, well, we have industry standards and lock-in effects start creating path dependency, and that increases the cost of making changes. And furthermore, some surveillance technologies are designed. They are designed to expand surveillance in ways that people will find not obvious and unexpected, but acclimate to. So for example, we could think of apps that keep asking users for permission to access data from other sources. That could be nudging consent creep. And additionally, as the debate over facial recognition technology demonstrates, once a technology is widely used, a sense of technological determinism becomes appealed to. So the police are saying, well, since facial recognition is already widely used and people are widely acclimated to it in the consumer sector, the genie's out of the bottle, and it is unfair for us to be hamstrung and not be given the same opportunities. And so I want to just end with one last harm that I consider to sort of follow from this favorably disposed normalization, and that's the slippery slope trajectory. I think favorably disposed normalization, and also in combination with these other normalization dynamics, I think it does stand a pretty good chance of contributing to a valid and very disturbing slippery slope. Here's one concern about slippery slopes and civil liberties that's a perennial concern. And I'm going to be quoting here philosopher Anneli Jefferson. Right. So she says, objections to infringements on civil liberties frequently point to the fact that we take the status quo as normal and we may not mind small restrictions being added. However, once we've gotten used to new restrictions, a further slight restriction might be introduced. In the end, so the thought goes, individuals will put up with restrictions they never would have accepted had they been all introduced at once. And so the question is there any empirical validity to this? And that requires differentiating between valid and invalid slippery slope claims. I mean, so as we all know in this audience, right, we're all told, when we teach our baby logic classes or you teach debate class, you're told, well, slippery slope argument, that's fallacious. Why? Because, you know, people are having moral panics. They're imagining a future that doesn't need to necessarily come. And so they're just picking out the worst of all possibilities without being causally precise about exactly why the dominoes are going to fall that way. But there's been a lot of research done on slippery slopes, and there are ways of differentiating between valid and invalid slippery slope claims. And one way is to look at slippery slope claims that are valid as not 100% determinative, but these are claims that are probabilistic. So these are scenarios about the future that you can make credible causal claims, and you can anchor these causal claims in what philosopher Douglas Walton calls a slippery slope driver. So what's a slippery slope driver? A slippery slope driver is something that we've observed historically having certain types of regular effects. So Walton says these include precedent, social acceptance, vagueness, technological change, and other scholars have identified a range of much more specific causal mechanisms. So I guess what I'm suggesting here is if favorably disposed normalization works causally on the mind in the ways that the research that Knob and Baer suggest it just might, I think that cognitive bias probably meets the criterion of being a slippery slope driver. It's something that would regularly have a certain type of causal impact that if society in the aggregate becomes more favorably disposed in this way, that would be one of the drivers fueling this slippery slope. And that's sort of where I wanted to leave things, just by sort of outlining some of the consequences of this. Again, I told you at the beginning, I wasn't going to be articulating a very strong normative opinion of my own. I just wanted to make better sense of where these conversations are going, what sort of can support them, and where, if the most speculative and dire normalization concern has merit and legs, what the kinds of consequences of that are. I'm going to stop the share so I can see everybody better. And again, I just want to reemphasize a point I made at the beginning. Like, I am the person here giving the talk, but this is research that was done in collaboration with Judy Ray.
Thank you, Evan. That was really, really interesting. And we have some time for discussion. So raise your hand either in person or through the evil machine, and I will call on you. Jay.
And I even managed to do it in the time allotted, huh?
You did. Very impressive. Jay, go ahead.
So I have to think about the slippery slope thing, but let me just reframe what you've said.
Sure.
It seems like surveillance is, at least the argument for surveillance that states make, is that it provides certain public goods. And if you want to do what they did in 1984, you'd have to have 1 million people reading records and surveilling people. And so you can't afford to do it. So you have to be selective about how to provide those public goods. You're only going to surveil certain kinds of people, though the Stasi apparently did hire like 1/4 of the German population. But and as that surveillance gets more effective and cheaper, then everybody's going to have more interest in using that particular technology to provide those public goods. So at one end, you have China, where they have very little privacy concerns, and they're very interested in the public goods, and they have extensive use of these systems. And at the other end, you have the United States. And just in terms of the United States, I think of driving. So we didn't object when they replaced toll booths with Easy Pass and video cameras because it was more convenient. So we were favorably inclined to that transition. We would find it bizarre if a cop said, you have to wait here for 3 hours while I check your registration, and that's going to take a long time because we're all
Sure.
using fax machines. You would say that's stupid. Don't do that. But what we've never done in the United States is say, if you get from point A to point B in the Easy Pass system faster than you could have at 65 miles an hour, we're going to automatically give you a ticket. We could easily do that. And the reason we haven't is that it's abhorrent to the privacy trade-offs that most Americans have. Now, your slippery
Wait,
slope argument.
I just want to ask you just a quick question on that. Why are you saying that, right? So the fact that we have automated cameras in a variety of traffic lights seems to show that we have already, to some extent, started doing exactly the thing that you just said we don't do.
And I think the limited use of automatic cameras actually makes my point, because it's possible. It's been demonstrated that it's possible to do, but it's not very commonly done. But okay, so now that we have these automated cameras, are you arguing that the slippery slope means we're going to start using them in ways that would push us beyond the actual trade-offs that we would make consciously? Or my faith is that Americans would push back, the people who don't like these cameras push back, and they just don't get implemented in those places. And so that what we're really concerned about here is avoiding fascism. Fascist governments use technologies in fascist ways, and liberal governments don't.
I'm going to give a direct response to this because okay, so I did hear it was on the Ezra Klein podcast the other day, and it was one of my favorite writers, Ted Chiang, was on there, and he was asked, or he made the statement like, would we worry so much about AI if every country was sort of governed like a benevolent Scandinavian country like Denmark? He's like, I don't think we would. And I catch that's what your point is, James, but I'm going to push back on some of your views. And again, I'm not necessarily making any predictions. I'm just saying I think the causal situation is a lot more complicated than someone who might assume that we've got a set of, let's just call them American values embedded in our Constitution and DNA that are very pro-liberty, and these are going to keep prevailing. And I'm going to stick to the example that you gave. So let's just take something like Easy Pass. Well, it wasn't that long ago that the New York mayor, this was like right before the pandemic, like I'm paraphrasing the quote from memory, but it's something like this. He's like, we got these Easy Pass cameras, but they barely scrape the tip of the iceberg of what we can do with this technology. Right? We're just registering whether people are like paying or not paying. But we could also quickly and easily and cheaply, because it's plug and play technology and the financial costs have plummeted, we can upgrade them with facial recognition technology. And so we can then start finding out if people who have outstanding warrants are suddenly passing through these things. I think that type of a logic, to go back to this ongoing surveillance, there are a lot of economic drivers that make that very palatable. So you have to weigh pushback. I mean, I'm trying to be a kind of real politic here, against the kinds of incentives that happen, particularly in crisis moments like we're in now, where budgets are slashed, concerns about public safety are high. I certainly think that makes people a bit more vulnerable to having, to use one of the ideas from this talk, selective attention about what is good now, and having a harder time imagining the ways in which these things can scale up. We find this now all the time with things like, facial recognition has received a boom during the pandemic because people have masks, and we want touchless ways, although new studies seem to be suggesting that COVID isn't being transmitted along surfaces, but we wanted ways where we didn't have to touch things, right? And so I guess you could combine a couple of these concerns to your point about the traffic light and say, there's a lot of economic incentive to take normal dumb cameras and really make them smart. And in the hands of both law enforcement, but I'm also not going to rule out the private sector, there's a lot of value from changing the forms of information like I gave in that thought experiment about walking down the street now where there's no facial recognition, to that becoming more and more ubiquitous. We're beginning to see this in England, for example. So they're just ahead of the game compared to us, right? And it didn't seem so bad there before from an American perspective because they had dumb cameras. But now they're starting to. So, and again, we could look to China or other places. And if this cognitive dynamic of favorably disposed normalization, if that is true, that the more widespread surveillance becomes, that will have a non-trivial causal impact on people thinking it's not so bad, that becomes another item to consider in the matrix. So I'm not going to make a prediction and say, no, you're wrong. All I'm saying is, I think the kinds of considerations that might lead to a less salutary future than you're imagining are a bit stronger than we often recognize. And I wanted to tease out what some of those drivers are in the talk. Does that? But to your point also, Jay, I do think it's interesting, just as a footnote, if we look at the debates right now, I think it's very fascinating. The debates about things like vaccine passports now, you have very unlikely bedfellows. So you have Fox News basically telling, their viewers that this is like the end of personal liberty and freedom as we know it. And then you have sort of normally progressive privacy and civil liberties advocates making their own sort of arguments about this technology actually not having a public health value and persisting in ways that would curb, but we don't yet know how this is going to play out, right? So I agree with you. There is always going to be a big freedom push in the U.S., but at least this is a way of understanding some reasons to maybe not overestimate that, if there is Am I answering you straight on?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I am concerned that there might be a diminution of concern about privacy because of the ubiquity of these technologies. But I just see the spread and proliferation of these technologies as the inevitable part of the equation. And the thing that's not inevitable is our reactions to it. And that's a political question as opposed to a technological one.
Gentlemen, I just want to make sure that I get to some other questions. So Julia and then Maria.
My question was, like, have we not progressed past the point that major change can occur? I mean, with the government funding and pushing surveillance forward on their own part in order to pursue like privacy and safety for the citizens of the state, as well as if there's a body of power that could enable change in the opposite direction towards like anti-surveillance and privacy for the user and individual.
So you want me to comment on whether we've hit the point of no return or not?
Yes, and then I guess also secondly, I'm asking whether or not there's even a body of power that could help regulate this actually like neutrally versus biased towards their own agenda.
So I'll answer these in reverse. There is no neutral. No, there's no neutrality. However, I do definitely. So I am weirdly going to be somewhat optimistic here in the following sense. So a few years ago, I don't know, already maybe two years ago, Woody Hartzog and I, who write together a lot, we got a call from the ACLU asking what's our position on facial recognition technology. And we said, this is the worst, biggest threat to obscurity ever. We think it should be banned. And they're like, wow, we do too. Okay. So Woody and I made some of the first arguments for this. And I will tell you, our colleagues were aghast and thought that we gave up thinking rationally. They're like, when did you guys put on the tinfoil hat? Like, come on, this is not how regulation works. All technologies are dual use. They've got some positives and some negatives. And the point of public policy is you want to have a balancing act. You want to let the good uses of innovation flow. You want to curb the bad uses. And we argued no, this is impossible. Like in practice, the equilibrium will never work. This is only going to tilt power in horribly unjust ways. And I've lost track. I should have counted this before the talk. But at this point, a number of US cities have enacted bans, not in the private sector, but in the public sector, preventing police from being able to use facial recognition technology. To me, this is literally, I mean, this is what we were pushing for as a matter of idea, but everyone thought we were crazy. But this will never, in the US, we never ban anything. We never ban anything because we're into freedom. So we are seeing some signs now, I think some promising signs that aren't just about like tokenism or Twitter outrage. Like we are seeing concrete policy signs suggesting that for some people, they see that things are going too far and are pushing back in this rather dramatic way. So I'm slightly hopeful on some days, but not from a neutral point of view.
Excellent. Maria.
Yeah, so thank you. So I had a different question, but I first wanted to make a comment because of course I'm from Denmark. And and the thing is that this normalization is enormous in Denmark, precisely for that reason. right? So people are not worried at all, and the COVID passports is coming, and like and people are like willing, in Sweden they don't have cash anymore, and so in terms of your talk, it's actually worse, you could say, right? So like the better your welfare and the more you trust your government, the more the normalization question becomes an issue, and it becomes worrisome, because people just so even like in terms of like Facebook, many people in Denmark think, even though it's an American company, the Danish state must have regulated it somehow, so it's actually not problematic, right? So like there's this like a massive trust in the system. Anyway, okay, but my question was actually about which it sort of relates to maybe some of those things, because I really like the obscurity story, and of course if you make sort of obscurity privacy through obscurity a value, then it's of course also clear that it's going to be inefficient, right? So that there is so if like normally we think of efficiency as a positive, as a benefit, and a lot of these technologies are sold through values of efficiency, don't you in a way have to make an argument for inefficiency, right? Like that there is like that because obscurity, the cost of obscurity is in a way inefficiency.
Yes, and we have. So absolutely, and it's so counter. I mean, look, it's not surprising that it's countercultural, right? Like Marcuse back in the 1960s was worried about one-dimensional, one-dimensional man and the triumph of instrumental rationality. What was instrumental rationality that he was worried about in the 1960s? It was the idea that they were optimizing ever more systems for heightened efficiency. I mean, whatever. I mean, you could tell whatever story you want to tell. You got the Heideggerian story, whatever. But the idea was that the more that these systems become hyper optimized for efficiency, the more we need to worry that, as with the tools, so with the members of society. So we begin to elevate efficiency to not only an engineering value, it becomes a social value, right? It becomes an ethical value. And the more that happens, the harder it is, practically speaking, to make pushes for inefficiency. But the most straightforward response I would have to that is, but that's sort of what rights are.
Yes.
Rights are inefficiencies, right? Like, what is the Fourth Amendment? It means the police can't just walk into your home, right? They need things like a warrant. What is a warrant? A warrant is a bit of friction built into the system where we say that, yes, you could potentially have more efficient outcomes, but they would be unjust. So I guess my quick answer to you is absolutely, right? The only way you preserve obscurity is by not having frictionless sharing that's ubiquitous. It's by not having interoperable systems that are constantly communicating with each other, right? Like you need to have design strategies that prevent the information from flowing in those ways. And it does push back against a kind of Silicon Valley mania that the more frictionless has been elevated to like, the summum bonum, right? It's like the highest cultural virtue. But again, I don't think it has to sound like you're a Luddite. I think one could always anchor this in just very straightforward, longstanding privacy and civil liberties observations that's what the law does. The law provides friction. And we haven't thought historically that that's obscene. We've tried to calibrate it.
Chris.
Well, I just want to say thank you. And then you did mention that we were guinea pigs. So I have one silly encouragement for you, and that would be to not linger as long as you did on the Where's Waldo slide, because that was the only portion of your talk where I didn't pay any attention.
Because you're finding Waldo?
I was looking for Waldo and having a little bit of nostalgia. But you started the talk by mentioning that the nature of surveillance is on the cusp of a very fundamental change. And then as we move forward, you hit number 4 about favorably disposed normalization. And it did seem to kind of hinge on this undifferentiated concept of normal. And so I guess my question is, can you explain a little bit more what exactly you believe this fundamental change to be? If if there is no real way to separate how we think about the normalization of this technology?
So I guess the confluence I was trying to point out, right? Like the 1 second repeat, when something like this. Two trends. One may very well be a long-standing cognitive trend that we're only beginning to better understand. So if Nobe and Baer are right, if we understand normality in this undifferentiated way, then the more ubiquitous something becomes, because they're looking at normality in terms of morally good, but also prevalent, we're blending these two, that might not be new. But what if they're right, like if these empirical studies provide some bona fides for that, then the massive shifts in surveillance would lead to a prevalence that we haven't been exposed to before. And so if the mind works the way that they suggest that it works, this would be a toxic combination, because it would mean that, I mean, I guess put very simply, as much as some people might like to believe, we have very refined policy discussions where we're able to think about costs and benefits and make some kind of rational calculus or semi-rational calculus, or, you know, figure out sort of what is good for society overall by thinking about these things. If seeing something as normal does make us favorably disposed, that means it's going to be harder for us to appreciate the downside. So our cost benefit calculus is going to be inherently skewed, and skewed in a problematic way where we, if they're right, as a cognitive bias, we wouldn't even realize that we're having skewed deliberation.
I think I understand the correspondence a little bit better. And then I guess this is similar to Julia's question. I was just thinking about how AI was originally developed, and I was kind of to emulate how an expert human would make decisions. And so I do wonder, what is the expert system here in terms of surveillance? Do we have that envisioned, or are we so concerned with the potential consequences here that, you know, we're looking for valid and invalid slippery slope arguments?
I don't think the expert system issue is the issue. I think it's even stranger than that, right? I think we're looking at, I mean, there are so many different bits of jargon for this, but we're looking at the idea that if it works, who cares why it works, right? I mean, this is kind of like a neural network idea, that it's not that we're building these systems to make judgments benchmarked to the way that some expert would make them. We just want certain standards of reliability. And if they're able to, so if a facial recognition system can have a certain accuracy threshold, if a facial characterization system that's going to determine that based on you looking at me, you're staring at me intently and you're thinking intently, like if it worked. So I don't think we're benchmarking these against some notion of phronesis or like, you know, practical judgment. These things are just being benchmarked in some sort of basic causal way. Like we come up with a standard, and we want these things to process massive amounts of information and very, very rapidly achieve certain kinds of optimistic goals. If our goals in law enforcement are suddenly, I mean, to bring this back to James's question, if we go back to the Stasi, it took a massive amount of manpower to create a surveillance state. You needed to create a system to incentivize neighbors and families to spy on neighbors and families, right? It was largely a human-driven system. If you have an automated system, automated systems don't sleep, they don't eat, they don't go on strike, they don't have loyalty problems. They do as they're told, because the goal isn't to build conscious machines or, again, replicate them based on a human standard. You just want to simplify them to the essential functions that you need. And if the essential functions are policing, to go back to that hypothetical example, we could easily just imagine very cheaply, based on current technology, taking existing cameras and providing very simple plug and play enhancements. Now, I personally believe that things like facial characterization are total junk science. I think it's just sort of digital phrenology. But the problem is these things are being packaged as if they're not. And so part of, I guess, one more point on your thing is, even if certain experts recognize these systems as inherently flawed, unfortunately, there's a lot of AI snake oil salesmen, and these things can have pernicious effects if people believe that they're accurate, even when they're not.
Thank you.
Evan, can I ask you a question? So the things like the favorably disposed normalization hypothesis, if I'm understanding correctly, these kind of explanations about how we get habituated to surveillance, how it gets normalized to us, they presuppose that privacy matters to us, but they provide explanations of how we can be manipulated out of that commitment, right?
Except I'm going to pause on manipulation. Yes and no, right? So if you take a very cynical view, yes, we're manipulated. If you take a less cynical view, you could just say that simply based on the variety of reasons that surveillance infrastructure expands, some of which we might be cynical, some of which we might not be cynical, merely the mere expansion of prevalence will have a manipulate. I just don't want to impute necessarily nefarious intent to the cognitive change.
Fair enough. My question doesn't turn on it. I guess what I'm saying is all of these hypotheses at some level presuppose that some idea of privacy matters to us, but we can be moved away from it without either noticing or without wanting to be moved away by it. And I guess my question is, what if the alternative explanation for normalization is that the weight of the value itself is just receding dramatically, that we don't care about privacy anymore, and that it's part of a process of value change, which applies to other values as well. So other values undergo that kind of change. What if that's the explanation?
I think it's a possible explanation, but I'm not moved. So I saw James put in the chat millennials, and I think that I'm glad you said that, James. I thoroughly disagree, and not just as a parent, but here's the thing, right? So I recently wrote a book review, like a real long review essay of a book written by a philosopher claiming that privacy is dead, and of course millennials, and I'm like, look, man, I'm a middle-aged white guy, and I'm not making that argument, and here's why. There's been a lot of nuanced sociological and ethnographic studies of this. And this stuff goes all the way back to Dana Boyd, but more people are working on this now. The question is, are we making armchair assumptions and lumping them into millennial behavior? Or are we actually looking at the slightly more sophisticated ways that people behave given the limited choices that they have? So to put this very straightforwardly, make 2 points. One, just look at something like an Insta and a Finsta account, right? What's a Finsta account? A Finsta account is when millennials have a hidden, right? This is tweens and teens, have a separate Instagram account that they use a pseudonym for. Why? Because their threat calculus for privacy, it's not the government. They don't care. They're not worried about surveillance capitalism of what's happening behind the system, but they are worried about their parents and they are worried about their friends, right? They are worried about social reputation. Privacy isn't dead for them. And the fact that they're willing to have a separate account where they can speak more freely about certain issues that they don't want to be publicly judged on, to me, that's at least just a very quick, rough and ready example that privacy decisions are made within very difficult systems. But even under these systems, I don't see evidence that people have stopped caring. To your deeper point, Nir, this is what's called the privacy paradox, which right? So some economists say, listen, economics is a dismal science. People profess to value privacy. Look at what they do, not at what they say. What they do demonstrates wanton disregard. But the problem with that interpretation of the privacy paradox is people make decisions within highly structured and mediated environments. So in the environments that we're in now, the individual costs of living up to our privacy ideals might be so high that we rationalize there's no point in living up to them. But that doesn't mean we've given up on them.
Yeah, I don't think it has to be binaric of either we're completely committed to it or that we've given up to it. I think that's not how values die, if you want to use that language. I think it might have slipped, just like the sort of relative weight of some other values in the last 3 years has risen. It's hard to sort of figure out what would be appropriate evidence for this, which I think is a problem. I mean, a sort of counter argument can be, by the way, I heard an interesting discussion on the radio comparing attitudes to the smallpox vaccine and the COVID vaccine, 100 years apart. And basically some of the arguments were that, when people would get on the train, as the smallpox vaccine was becoming prevalent, they would be required to raise their sleeves to show the vaccine scar. And that after a little bit of pushback, on privacy grounds, people said, whatever, we want to, get things going again, no problem. And the sort of explanation seemed to be that some of the vaccine resistance actually now has to do, with privacy reasons, with a sort of misplaced but somewhat genuine or a mostly genuine set of concerns about privacy. I don't know. I think, that's what I mean when I say that it's hard to find what would count as appropriate or legitimate evidence for this.
I know we're out of time, but I just add one last factor. I think
Sure.
part of the issue here, and this goes back to a point I made earlier in the talk about the lack of sort of visceral ways in which privacy and surveillance are both felt and discussed. Just take something simple like social media. They are deliberately designed so that we don't feel like we're talking through a platform. We feel very comfortable. We feel a fake sense of intimacy. These are designed for us to let down our guard so we think in the moment we're phenomenologically communicating with friends, even if intellectually we know in the back of our minds there's a whole surveillance apparatus. So I do think part of what happens when we see certain behaviors that from the outside suggest that people don't care, we have to remember they're specifically designed to not trigger the adaptive mechanisms that have historically been associated with concerns about privacy.
Right, right. Evan, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. We are out of time, but thank you for making time for us. And I hope that you'll come back, maybe in person when the world is real again.
That'd be great. Yeah, thanks again for inviting me. This was great.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.